Welcome. Good to see you all here again this week, and thanks for joining us, those of you on Zoom, for another session of the workshop in the history of material texts. I'm Zach Lesser, professor in the English department, and I organized the seminar along with Jerry Singerman, humanities editor emeritus at the Press, and John Pollack, Kislak Center curator, and Eileen Malcolm, who is Bristol Schoenberg fellow in the history of material texts. Eileen will pass around a sign-in sheet, which is we never do anything with them, and they pile up, but they always have been happening, and we imagine them as evidence in case of necessity to prove our worth. But also, if you are not on the email list and you'd like to hear from us no more than twice a week, basically a reminder and an announcement about the upcoming talk, just put your email on there. If you're on Zoom and you'd like, I know we have some people joining for the first time. If you'd like to be on our email list, just drop a note in the chat, or you can go to our website and you'll find the information there. Also, on those of you on Zoom can participate in Q&A afterwards. The chat's open too. You can use the raise hand function, and we will call on you to ask your question live if you want, or just put it in the chat. Just a reminder that you can see all of our upcoming speakers and their titles at our website, penmaterialtext.org. The seminar covers a very broad range of topics, as you can see from our first talks this semester. Last week on the first Black comic book, produced in 1947. This week we have 16th and 17th century travel literature. Next week, we'll have Ulrich von Bülow from the German Literature Archive at Marbach talking about W.G. Sebald's papers and photographs. Plenty of other terrific talks coming up, so we hope to see you each Monday, or any Monday, as you like. And I'm very happy to welcome back to the seminar someone who feels like one of our own. Joe Rezek is Associate Professor and Director of the American and New England Studies program at Boston University. But we know him as a regular attendee and speaker at the Material Text Workshop, especially during 2009 to 11 when he was in Philadelphia as a McNeil Center postdoc, and in 2016 when he was a fellow at the Library Company. Joe received his BA from Columbia in 2001, which I realize means we may have just passed it through the halls of Butler Library without knowing each other. And he got his PhD from UCLA in 2009. He's the author of a monograph that I'll mention in a moment, a second in progress, a ton of essays, and one famous and seriously viral tweet about the musical Rent. Joe previously spoke to our group in 2012, which is, I think, when I met you for the first time, about the transatlantic publication and reception of Scott's Waverley novels, which went on to form part of his first monograph, London and the Making of Provincial Literature, Aesthetics and the Transatlantic Book Trade, 1800 to 1850, published by Penn Press in 2015 in the Material Text book series. The book, according to one reviewer, fundamentally challenges our understanding of the nation as a category of analysis in American book history. While this book was primarily concerned with romantic aesthetics, Joe began to tackle in that book the relationship between the book trade and imperialism. He's taken up the question of books in relation to racial imperialism more directly in recent work, including a talk he gave to us in 2016 on the lost sermon of David Margaret, known as Black Moses, as well as that talk was also about the Countess of Huntingdon and Phyllis Wheatley. And Wheatley's poetry forms one of his key texts in his new book, The Racialization of Print, to be published by the Omohundro Institute and UNC Press, as I believe does the talk he'll give tonight. And in this new book, Joe, as he puts it on his website, provides a new genealogy of the distinctively modern idea that a printed book can index the nature of a race. So it's great to have you back in this room, Joe, and we'll all look forward to hearing about Ideologies of the Codex in Richard Hakluyt and John Smith.
Yeah. Okay. Hi everyone, it's really great to be back. As Zach, mentioned, I've been here many times before as a McNeil Fellow, and as a fellow at the Library Company, and as a participant. This is sort of my intellectual home. My book is a material text book So nurtured, very much nurtured in this environment. I'm totally thrilled to see old friends here and some new people, even some of my students have come. So I'm really happy to share some of this work with you. So thanks, Zach, again for inviting me to speak. And we're just gonna get started. Actually, on the wrong slide. This is a reveal. Okay, there's my title. Okay, I don't have to remind you that one of the most influential statements about the importance of print in the early modern period comes from Francis Bacon, writing in 1620. It helps to notice the force, power, and consequences of discoveries which appear at their clearest in three things that were unknown to antiquity and whose origins, though recent, are obscure and unsung, namely the art of printing, gunpowder, and the nautical compass. In fact, these three things have changed the face and condition of things all over the globe, the first in literature, the second in the art of war, and the third in navigation. Elizabeth Eisenstein used these famous remarks from Novum Organum as an epigraph to the 1968 essay that grew into her field-defining work, The Printing Press as an Agent of Change. Eisenstein took not those two, this one passage. Eisenstein took her cue from Bacon and attempted to confirm his claim about the radical cultural changes affected by the advent of printing, although she had less to say about war and global exploration. As it happens, this passage in Novum Organum is immediately preceded by an equally fascinating passage Eisenstein left out, a comparison between the mechanical arts of Europe and the supposed absence of such arts in the Americas. Okay, we're all good. So here's the passage that she doesn't include. Let anyone reflect how great is the difference between the life of men in any of the most civilized provinces of Europe and in the most savage and barbarous region of New India, and he will judge that they differ so much that deservedly it may be said that man is a god to man, not only for help and benefit, but also in the contrast between their conditions. And this is due not to soil, climate, or bodily qualities, but to arts. Bacon assumes these modern discoveries were made in Europe, and this is, of course, all a myth. Those three things were not invented in Europe. That myth persists to this day, and it was resonant for Eisenstein. More importantly, though, with this comparison, Bacon makes his definition of European civilization dependent on a contrast with barbarous regions in America that lack arts like printing. Okay, so I'm not going to blame Eisenstein for leaving out the earlier passage here. Her concern was with Europe, after all, and not America. In this talk, though, and in my work more broadly, I'm concerned with both, and particularly the binary that Bacon sets up between them. Contrasts like Bacon's worked to define the art of printing as inherently, not accidentally, European. This happens through the geographical scale of his comparative method, which remains central to the idea that the medium, along with its brother discoveries, changed the face and condition of things all over the globe. Okay, so the process of Europeanizing print, which I talk about, is ideological, and it was powerful and lasting in the early modern period. It is an important precondition for what I've been calling the racialization of print, which I define as the centuries-long, non-inevitable procedure through which printed objects became powerfully associated with white supremacy and ideologies of racial hierarchy. This process is indeed the subject of the book that Zach mentioned, that I'm currently writing, and my talk today about Richard Hakluyt and John Smith is drawn from the first chapter. Bacon's insistence that arts and not inherent bodily qualities are responsible for the contrast between civilization and barbarism suggests that he wrote at a time when concepts of modern racial difference had begun to emerge, but were not yet solidified. I'm just going to sketch this book in a paragraph, okay? It's a long chronology, so you see where I'm going after this first chapter. So my work on the racialization of print, as Zach did mention, traces the historical emergence of the idea that a single book, by virtue of its author's racial identity, might reveal profound truths about an entire race of people. The project begins in the early modern period here with the spread of printing in Europe and the rise of modern racial categories, and it ends in the mid-19th century with the industrialization of print and the codification of scientific racism. I argue that it was only after the Age of Revolution, the age of Phyllis Wheatley, who really is the project's central figure, that readers in the Anglophone world came to believe that a printed book provides insight into the nature of its author's race, which is what Wheatley's book did for people. In the 19th century, this indexical logic was embraced by many Black and Native American writers who published texts explicitly to forward the cause of racial justice. So the earliest part of this long process, the hyper-elite medium of print, of the printed codex, slowly acquired an association with white authorship. And this had to happen before print could much later be tied to essentialized racial logics of the kind that Wheatley faced in her reception. So my work on Hakluyt and Smith comprises the first chronological episode of that larger story, writing as they did before whiteness as a racial category fully emerged in the late 17th century. And I'm in great company now in the field of book history with people writing about race. Elizabeth McHenry, Francis Smith Foster, Philip Brown, Christian Silva Grez's great new book about Cotton Mather, Raul Coronado's work, Jordan Stein and Laura Cohen's books. There's a lot of people working on these issues. My work is sort of distinguished by its focus on the codex as a form and the kind of problems and meanings that these giant books, some of which are on the table here, what they meant to readers. And also in my absurdly long chronology. So I start 1585 and I go all the way to Frederick Douglass, who's the final figure of the book. So today I want to suggest that print became presumptively European as authors repeatedly contrasted their own identities with non-European, non-Christian people they cast only as objects in print's field of representation. So through focusing on two monumental codices of this period, Hakluyt's The Principal Navigations, Voyages, Traffics, and Discoveries of the English Nation, published in 3 volumes from 1598 to 1600, and John Smith's The General History of Virginia, New England and the Summer Isles, published in 1624, I hope to show how complicated and varied the Europeanization of print was in the Anglophone context. Okay, since Eisenstein made her arguments on behalf of Francis Bacon, which is how I think of it, no scholar working on the questions that interest me has been more important than Walter Mignolo. In The Darker Side of the Renaissance, he considered the clash between Spanish and Amerindian societies in the 16th century to argue that the printed book became a medium associated with European colonial ambition. According to Mignolo, Western ideologies of literacy and history that printed books came to symbolize, ideologies long associated with the bright cultural advances of the Renaissance, were responsible for the much darker process of colonization itself. My work here begins with Mignolo's fundamental insight about the kind of metropolitan authority printed books embodied. During the process of colonization, the book was conceived by Spaniards as a container in which knowledge from the New World could be deposited, as a carrier by means of which signs could be transmitted to the metropolis, and finally as a text in which truth could be discerned from falsehood, the law imposed over chaos. Hakluyt and Smith also conceived of printed books as objects that could sort out truth and law from falsehood and chaos. To identify how a medium acquires ideologies, however, we need to emphasize process, I think, even more than Mignolo does. He argues that the Spanish imported a European ideology of the book to the New World that was ultimately imposed on Amerindian ways of record keeping. But he leaves little room for the idea that a colonizer's conception of what a book means could itself have been shaped and reshaped by violent encounter and conquest. I hope to suggest on a granular level that print authorship became meaningfully European through the process of such encounters and their mediations. So today I'll speak mostly about John Smith, but I'll begin briefly with Hakluyt to sort of set the stage for him. I'll be arguing ultimately that the key to understanding Smith's authorial persona is revealed in revisions he made to his early writings for their inclusion in the General History, the folio book he hoped would monumentalize his achievements as a colonizer. Okay, so first Hakluyt, and here's the very handsomely bound 3-volume edition at the John Carter Brown Library, which I was lucky enough to see earlier this year. So Richard Hakluyt, many of you know, and I realize I'm talking about the Renaissance in front of Zach, so I'm very excited that there are some Renaissance people here. As an Americanist, you know, we get to go all the way from the Civil War back to the very beginning of colonization. So it's sort of like you just stay on this side of the Atlantic, you just go back further, and you hop over to England without worrying too much about what's happening in Europe. So I realize that's exactly what I'm doing here, and I'm very proud of that fact. Okay, so anyway, Richard Hakluyt became one of the most important Elizabethan era propagandists for North American colonization through direct advocacy at court and the publication of several influential printed books. For the 3-volume Principal Navigations, an expansion of an earlier work, he gathered hundreds of travel narratives from the medieval period to the present, covering English travelers' experiences in Africa, the Mideast, the Far East, Russia, Lapland, and especially the Americas. Hakluyt's book included dozens of important narratives that would become famous, including Thomas Harriot's 1587 report about Roanoke, Sir Walter Raleigh's attempts to find El Dorado, John Hawkins' several travels to Africa, Martin Frobisher's search for the Northwest Passage, and global circumnavigations by Francis Drake and Thomas Cavendish. Principal Navigations enshrined and disseminated exoticized depictions of non-European people and their ways of life, described with widely varying attitudes, but always tainted by the moral, religious, and cultural judgments of Western European perspectives. Long recognized by historians like David Armitage and Peter Moncall as a nationalist Protestant epic, Principal Navigations offered English readers stories about their nation's history of foreign exploration, and also attempted to establish the superiority and internal coherence of Christendom. Jennifer L. Morgan has argued that books like Hakluyt's, quote, erected a boundary that made English expansion in the face of confused and uncivilized peoples reasonable, profitable, and moral. Early modern cultural historians, since Winthrop Jordan and Kim Hall, have used sources from Hakluyt to explore early modern racial ideology. And I'm prepared to talk about sort of historiographical debates about the development of racial ideology over time, from the medieval period up through the early modern period. There's a lot of debates about the origins of race and racialized thinking. I'm concerned with modern racial ideologies that we can distinguish from the kinds of racial thinking that happens in the medieval period. But Hakluyt is a real central tome for people who want to understand early modern racial ideology. So just briefly with Hakluyt, I want to suggest that the objectifying rhetoric of the voyages, which is very important to historians, haunts Hakluyt's own self-representation as the creator of this codex. So in the opening paragraph to his 1598 preface, Hakluyt uses the language of the body to describe the process of reading, searching, compiling, editing, and publication. Quote, "What restless nights, what painful days," he writes, "what heat, what cold have I endured? How many long and chargeable journeys have I traveled compiling all this?" Recompense for his body's wreckage appears to lie in his creation of another body, the book itself. To further describe his labor, Hakluyt draws on well-worn tropes that analogize books to bodies and cast the republication of lost texts as illumination and resurrection. This is Hakluyt. "Having, for the benefit and honor of my country, zealously bestowed so many years, so much travail and cost, to bring antiquities smothered and buried in dark silence to light, and to preserve certain memorable exploits of late years by our English nation achieved from the greedy and devouring jaws of oblivion, to gather likewise, and as it were to incorporate into one body, the torn and scattered limbs of our ancient and late navigations by sea, our voyages by land, and traffics of merchandise of both, and having so much as it in me lieth restored each particular member, being before displaced to their true joints and ligaments, I presume to offer unto thy view this first part of my threefold discourse." So this description of his labor weaves together the language of embodiment, dismemberment, and restoration to create a quasi-messianic process. England is imagined as both timeless, ancient and late, and vulnerable to the greedy and devouring jaws of oblivion. Hakluyt cast his actions not as creative, but restorative. Alluding to Christian doctrines of the resurrection of the body, Hakluyt gathers, reincorporates, and reorganizes into one body several pieces that had been lost in darkness. As Leah Whittington has written, Renaissance editors often, quote, trumpeted their bibliographic and philological activities as miracles of resuscitation. Editing, she goes on to say, was the process of repairing wounds, of rehabilitating damaged limbs, and restoring the whole textual body to its pristine, uninjured condition. In Hakluyt's case, the image of him reattaching the scattered limbs of lost texts to their true joints and ligaments presupposes a previously existing corporate body of national triumphs in voyaging, even though the fabrication of such a body is so obviously to readers the explicit project of principal navigations itself. So Hakluyt's embodied metaphor of the book resonates throughout the 3 volumes in numerous scenes of bodily destruction that occur seemingly without discrimination all over the world. Foreign voyaging always comes with the risk of violent death. Countless individuals, you read these books, succumb to starvation, battle, plague, infection, poisoned arrows, shipwreck, piracy, torture, fire, flood, slaughter, beheading, evisceration at the hands of infidels, in his language, heathens, savages, Indians, or Christian enemies, especially the Spanish. Okay, Francis Drake, for example, I'm going to give you some bloody passages. Okay, so Francis Drake, for example, in his 1585 voyage, condemns the Spanish colonists in Santiago, Cape Verde, for mutilating the corpse of a young English sailor, for, quote, the rude manner of killing and savage kind of handling of the dead body of one of our boys found by them straggling all alone, from whom they had taken his head and heart and straggled other bowels about the place in a most brutish and beastly manner. Lawrence Kemmis's 1596 narrative describes cannibals in Guyana. Quote, these speak the language of the Indians of Dominica. They are but few, but very cruel to their enemies, for they bind and eat them piecemeal alive. John Hawkins reported from Guinea in 1564 that hundreds of Africans attacked his men by the shore, shooting at them in the boats and cutting them into pieces which were drowned in the water. George Peckham, writing about Humphrey Gilbert's 1583 voyage to Newfoundland, spread rumors about cannibals there, a cruel kind of people, whose food is man flesh and have teeth like dogs. They pursue their neighbors with ravenous minds to eat their flesh and devour them. Bodily destructions like these echo Hakluyt's description of the scattered limbs of England's navigatory records torn by the greedy and devouring jaws of oblivion. There's much more to say here, but my point is to suggest that Principal Navigations juxtaposes the violence of global voyaging in non-European lands with the restorative balm of Hakluyt's activities as a metropolitan compiler and editor. With such juxtaposition, I argue, it yokes them together. Hakluyt's process of assembling distant voyages into a new body, the Codex, grounds his identity as a European editor and author wishing to address the world as a whole. With so many bodies and records lost to darkness, to trope on Kim Hall, Hakluyt uses print to bring them back to life and into the light. It is the darkness that I'm saying that makes the light. Okay, part 2, John Smith and print authorship. This is actually a 19th century engraving of John Smith. So this is not the handsome John Smith you know from the Disney movie. This is a 19th century engraving. Okay, so published a quarter century after Principal Navigations, and in the wake of Francis Bacon's Novum Organum, John Smith, the General History of Virginia, aimed to provide a lasting full-length history of Jamestown. While Hakluyt had global representational ambitions, Smith wrote mostly a local story. Both examples reveal the process through which print authorship gathered European association in the context of colonization. So as many of you know, the Virginia section of the General History covers now familiar episodes occurring in the region around the Jamestown settlement, known in Algonquin as Senacomoco, beginning with the arrival of Smith and other settlers in 1607. Some historians believe Smith brought a copy of Hakluyt's Principal Navigations with him to the region. Although Smith himself returned to England in 1609, the history narrates events in Jamestown up to the beginning of the Second Anglo-Powhatan War, after a native attack that killed a quarter of the English population in March 1622. It's a complicated history if you don't study Jamestown, but the point is that John Smith was there for 2 years at the very, very beginning, and then he goes back to England and never comes back. But then a decade later, he writes the General History of Virginia, right? After an attack that killed many people in the Jamestown settlement. In the 1622 attack, John Smith really desperately wanted to go back to Virginia. But they said, no, you're a terrible colonist. We're not sending you back. You cannot do anything. You have to stay in England and rot. He said, fine, I'll write a book. And so his direct response to this attack, which for a long time people called a massacre in 1622, was to write the General History of Virginia. So the General History of Virginia is his revenge, really, for not being able to go back to the Americas to continue fighting the native people there. Truly the most fascinating for me and understudied aspects of Smith's authorial process are additions and changes that distinguish the general history from its source text. The General History of Virginia is sort of like, it's a 6-book tome where he compiled a lot of the documents from the history of Jamestown. He revised them for this sort of permanent monument. For the story of his own time in Jamestown, Smith drew upon a book that was published in 1612 with 2 texts, a map of Virginia and the proceedings of the English colony. The latter is the source for book 3 of General History, which is the most famous version, most famous part of the General History. If you have the Norton Anthology of American Literature, it is book 3 of the General History of Virginia that is in there, and that tells the story of Pocahontas, where Smith is held captive, and Pocahontas supposedly saves his life, right? Powhatan is going to execute him, and she says, no, no, don't kill John Smith, and then he saves his life. So everyone knows now that that is not a scene of execution. Smith made a mistake here. He was being ritually adopted into Powhatan's empire as a kind of vassal or subordinate, but he misinterpreted this event. The source text is on the top here, and that's a little Cordo, okay, the 1612 proceedings of the history of the English colony in Virginia. And when Smith goes to write his story after he's been rejected by the Virginia Company, he produces a giant folio. And he added about 30% of content to this earlier version, the 1612 Cordo. And so what fascinates me here is that his rejection by the Virginia Company led him to attempt another mode of conquest, to monumentalize English superiority in print. And the scale and substance of Smith's expansion for the general history matched the shift in format from an ephemeral Cordo to an elegant folio meant to last. And he added the story of this supposed execution for the folio format. So I'm going to take my cue from editors of Shakespeare here. And in my discussion of his revisions, I'm going to refer to the first version here as the Cordo and the second version as the folio. No one in Smith studies does that at all. No one in Smith studies cares at all about format, right? They just care that he changed the story. But for me, the change in format is really important to the change in the story. And I'll be arguing about the folio that Smith's masculine self-presentation as a soldier and his use of Pocahontas, especially to establish authority, happens along the axis of gender. So for a minute here, the historiography on Smith and Jamestown is of course vast. I've drawn on people like Philip Barber, Everett Emerson, Kathleen Brown, Daniel Richter, Kathleen Donegan, Jeffrey Glover. There's a really beautiful 3-volume complete works of Captain John Smith, published by the Omohundro Institute in 1986, but it's edited for historians. And so that edition of John Smith does not have a list of the hundreds of variants that occur between the Cordo and the folio. It has sort of summaries of things that he changed, passages he added, and so on. If it had been edited for literary scholars, you might have had a complete list of substantive changes, right? So I collated just book 3, because it's a giant book, and there are just dozens and dozens of tiny changes that historians have not noted between the Cordo and the folio editions of John Smith. And so that's what really interests me, doing a close reading of these changes. Everyone knows he added the execution scene, because that's a big giant thing. It's about Pocahontas and so on. But I'm interested in some of the minor changes that have been overlooked by historians and how that can help us understand Smith's performance here as a giant folio author. Okay, so Smith clearly used folio publication to burnish the status of Captain Smith as a hero. The folio is a more bloody and violent text. Indigenous enemies everywhere in the folio are more savage, menacing, and dehumanized, while English settlers are seen more often as valiant and brave. So in one representative edition, Smith elaborates the story of how trade began with a local Indian group. In the Cordo, relations are established quickly and peacefully. Not so in the folio, and this is a new passage where Smith let fly his muskets among them, after which 60 or 70 of them, some black, some red, some white, some partly colored, came in a square order, singing and dancing out of the woods with their oki, which was an idol made of skin stuffed with moss, all painted and hung with chains and copper borne before them. And in this manner, being well armed with clubs, targets, bows, and arrows, they charged the English, so that so kindly received them with their muskets loaden with pistol shot, that down fell their god, and diverse lay sprawling on the ground, The rest fled again to the woods and ere long sent one of their Koyakan to offer peace and redeem their oki. Smith told them if only six of them would come unarmed and load his boat, he would not only be their friend, but restore them their oki. So given the importance of religious difference as justification for colonization, this new passage raises the symbolic stakes of the scene with the appearance, damage, and restoration of the native idol. The introduction of violence makes the encounter a Baconian contrast, pitting the clubs, targets, bows and arrows against muskets loaded with pistol shot with gunpowder. In the Quarto, Smith and his indigenous neighbors merely discoursed and kindly traded. In the Folio, such relations are mediated through violence and are only possible once Smith damages and restores their idol. So he made many more revisions than I have space to discuss here. Here's my little part of my chart. He added a new episode about using a table book to communicate with fellow Englishmen, which emphasizes European control over technologies of writing. He expanded another Baconian passage where he amazes Native Americans with the technology of a compass dial. And in some cases, he substitutes the word colony in a few instances for less politicized descriptions of the settlement. Almost laughably, Smith in one case simply inflates the number of indigenous people he encounters. Oh, 300 people in the Quarto, in the Folio, oh, there are 4,000 people. So he's really just like inflating everything for this. And my point here is that this is a process for him, right? It's a process of going from one version to another, one format to another, creates this kind of sense of his own monumental superiority here. Okay, the most famous additions Smith made illustrate the importance of gender. These additions, as I mentioned, tell the story of his captivity late in 1607 and how Pocahontas supposedly saved his life. In the Quarto, his imprisonment lasts less than half a page. For the Folio, Smith added 2,000 words. He depicts himself as steady, manly, and superior, while numerous indigenous religious rites and threats to his life swirl around him. And this is a very famous image from the 1624 version of the General History. And there he is there on the block with Pocahontas in the front. I'll be talking about that image more at the very end. So in the execution scene, a potentially emasculating moment for Smith, he dramatizes Pocahontas's power to grant clemency. Having feasted him after their best barbarous manner they could, a long consultation was held, but the conclusion was 2 great stones were brought before Powhatan. Then as many as could laid hands on him dragged him to them, and thereon laid his head, and began ready with their clubs to beat out his brains. Pocahontas, the king's dearest daughter, when no entreaty could prevail, got his head in her arms, and laid down her own upon his to save him from death, whereat the emperor was contented he should live. Okay, didn't happen. Okay, but there it is. Okay, the noise and numbers of the opening phrases reinforced Smith's centrality, with the barbarous manner and many hands of the natives surrounding him as a solitary Christian subject. In contrast to the 2 great stones and blunt clubs that will bash Smith's brains, Pocahontas is strikingly feminized here, even for Smith. She is the king's dearest daughter, filled with entreaty and armed only with her embrace. She gathers his head in her arms and bows hers toward him in a motherly gesture. Smith's masculine persona in this moment depends wholly on the performance of Pocahontas's femininity. So textual revisions and additions elsewhere in the Folio work with this passage to establish Pocahontas as the self-sacrificing heroine of Smith's epic. And here's one thing on my chart. Not long after this episode, it's very small, I'm sorry, when Smith has become president of the colony, he records a scene where 30 young women came naked out of the woods to dance before him and his men. In the Folio, he added a protagonist. Now it's Pocahontas and her women who entertain Captain Smith. And to make the scene more relaxing and pleasurable for the colonists, furthermore, Pocahontas ensures the safety of the Englishmen by offering her own life as a guarantee. Presently, Pocahontas came, Smith writes in the Folio, willing him to kill her if any hurt were intended. So the new romance, this is a new romance of Pocahontas' devotion to Smith, depends on her willingness to put herself on the edge of death. Through risking her life, this new character in the Folio anoints the great men around her as superior in strength, stature, and humanity. So many people, of course, have understood this iconic scene as a gendered allegory for colonization. A native woman enthralled to an Englishman, Pocahontas is meant to represent all indigenous Americans and their preference for European Christian civilization. So, but in the time that remains, about 6 minutes, I wish to suggest, I timed it for you, I wish to suggest that the scene is also an allegory for Smith's authorial posture. This will depend first on looking at the book's opening dedication, a dedication tied to format. To fund the publication of the giant book and to grant it legitimacy, Smith secured the patronage of the Duchess of Richmond and Lennox. There she is. In the book's dedication to her, Smith lists a group of women from around the globe who have protected him from perils greater than authorship. If you know anything about Smith, you know he fought on the continent for a while before he went to the Americas. He was enslaved and sold in Turkey as a slave, and he lots of women fell in love with him there, if you're to believe him. Okay, so in the dedication, this is what he says. Heretofore, honorable and virtuous ladies, and comparable but amongst themselves, have offered me rescue and protection in my greatest dangers. Even in foreign parts, I have felt relief from that sex. In the utmost of many extremities, that blessed Pocahontas, the great king's daughter of Virginia, oft saved my life. There's the passage. And so verily, these my adventures have tasted the same influence from your gracious hand, Duchess, which hath given birth to the publication of this narration. So if the Duchess is the book's aristocratic patron in England, Pocahontas acts as Smith's aristocratic patron in Virginia. Indeed, the Duchess and Pocahontas are connected by two parallel, materially equivalent engraved portraits in the folio. These are another, very famous image of Matoka, which is Pocahontas' Algonquin name here, now all Englishified because she married John Rolfe, the Englishman, right? So these are the two portraits besides Smith's we have in the folio. So Pocahontas' gesture in the execution scene harnesses her father's power and bestows it upon Smith. Through offering her protection, and rejecting her father's will, she supports Smith's transformation into an author, just like the Duchess of Richmond does. Both feminine gestures promote and legitimize Smith's voice. After Pocahontas' blessing in the execution scene, Smith lives to tell his story on his own terms. The allegory of colonization depends upon and reinforces the allegory of print authorship. So the execution scene itself went through a transformation between the Cordo and the folio. So on the left here, you have an image from the Cordo, the 1612 publication, which there's no execution scene because it does not present in the Cordo version, and that's an engraving by William Hull. And then on the right, you have the expansion of the scene as the engraver modified the image for the General History of Virginia. John Pollock was kind enough to bring out the source text for many of these images, which is Theodore Debris' description of Virginia. And there's a lot to say about these engravings and how basically what the engraver did was just lift images from earlier depictions of the Americas and throw them into Smith's General History of Virginia. And I can talk about that more if we need to. But we see the change here as visual as well. So in the foreground of the folio engraving here, Smith lies prostrate face up with his head on a block. Two native people hold up clubs, almost sickle-like weapons ready to strike. Smith's hat has been tossed off to the left at the feet of a row of observers. Powhatan looms in the background next to a giant fire. In the absolute foreground of the image, with her knee merging into the picture's thin black frame, Pocahontas faces away from us with her head bowed and hand on Smith's chest. Smith's face is visible, his body is exposed and vulnerable, but he retains control. Pocahontas demurs from the reader and blesses his body with prayer. It's sort of an act of worship. So in many ways, Pocahontas interrupts a danse macabre. The menacing, half-naked, skeletal-like figures encircle Smith and foretell his death, mocking the vanity of his human wishes. For me, the scene recalls one of the most famous illustrations of a danse macabre, the oldest surviving depiction of a European printing shop. So up here we have Matthias Huss's famous 1499 image, which was imitated and adapted many times in the ensuing centuries, a picture of a print shop. Striking visual rhymes connect the two scenes. The tall native figures in the background of the Smith tableau resemble the giant skeletons in the print shop, and the ink beater in the back with his raised ball behind the printing press. Smith's head rests on a block ready to be permanently imprinted by the heavy club of his executioners. The Powhatan Indians, with heads and shoulders painted red, are like so many printer's devils covered with ink. Pocahontas saves Smith by pressing her hand upon his chest, joining his own arm in a gentle parallel. So a scene of destruction, Smith's death, becomes instead a scene of publication. We read Smith's open, legible, exposed face as we would a narrative on paper. So to conclude, Richard Hakluyt used print to fight death. Publication was a kind of resurrection. The same dynamics are at work in the allegories Smith enshrined in the general history. With their elite, expensive, aristocratically supported folios, Richard Hakluyt and John Smith joined hundreds of other men of their time who developed and consolidated doctrines of European superiority, largely by the way of circulating printed texts. Their books played a crucial role in the procedure Sylvia Wynter describes, whereby elite Europeans overrepresented themselves as the human, as the universal referent for mankind. This overrepresentation needed to be refreshed and reinforced over and over again, and the iterative nature of print technology proved both suited for this and also essential. Process is central for Wynter. This was, quote, the West's reinvention of its true Christian self in the transmuted terms of the rational self of man, she writes. By the time England began launching full-throated colonization efforts at the end of the 16th century, the printed codex had become the dominant medium for disseminating the kinds of overrepresentations Wynter examines. The dissemination of such discourse in print was necessary over the course of the subsequent 2 centuries for the emergence of modern racism itself. Thank you.
Okay, questions are open. If you're on Zoom, feel free to use raise hand. Yeah, sure.
Simple question. Who is the very imposing, almost classical figure on the right?
She is someone who is a local queen who had been sent to get him water. So,
And do you have any thoughts on her regal domination
of the scene?
Yeah.
Now, with the zoom, can I get back to the image? Is that? Or,
Yeah, you can.
Okay.
If you just.
Yeah, I actually don't have a giant amount to say about her, except she's also presiding. You're noticing that she has like an equal weight or even a dominant weight in the picture there. Yeah, I mean, weirdly, she's mentioned in passing in the narrative itself, but visually there's such a big presence.
Yeah, almost wearing a Roman cloak.
Yeah. I mean, it's sort of like the present. It's sort of like I would relate it maybe to the kind of presentation of the author, or kind of like a frontispiece figure. Also, like being dominant, but ceding ground to the main scene here. I would just be thinking out loud, but yeah, I think that's. Narratively, the centerpiece is what's happening to Smith. But visually, you're right. There's a big presence there that's neoclassical. I mean, the images from Debris are all sort of neoclassicalizations of the people of the Sounds region. So it's happening there too.
I have a related question. I think that scale has to be important in this image, and especially because you're talking about transformations of scale from the sort of, it matters to me. I think that Smith is so much larger than people have. And I don't know. I mean, who knows what this other figure is, but there are tiny people in this composition, and they are designated as like racial others in relation to Smith. So I think talking about scale could really help you.
Yeah, and what I would point out there is that Powhatan is big, and that is he's a bigger presence in the folio too. He's called for the first time an emperor in the folio. So Smith really has to inflate or increase the size of his principal antagonist in order to make his epic journey kind of like more impressive. So I think there's some resonance here too with that as well. Yeah.
Sorry to keep on this trail, but I mean, and also to ask about Pocahontas, because you're like, okay, whatever. But she's up there, but she's kind of small too. But I mean, it seems to me that she maybe troubles
the sort of narrative in the sense of like, civilized Europe and savage other. I mean, yes, there's scholarship on Pocahontas about that, but I just wondered what you thought about it and, her equation with the Duchess and her Europeanization, right? So, I mean, and that she's a figure of clemency, not of savagery. Like, so I just wanted to see how that her exceptionality plays into your thinking about the argument.
Yes, and I would say that it's all tied up in who gets to be the author in this situation, right? So I think in terms of me tying the kind of like the contrast that Smith is interested in drawing between civilization and barbarism, between someone who can be literate, someone who's illiterate, who has control over authorship, who's going to be a writer. I think that the Pocahontas' exceptionality here as someone who then becomes civilized, adopts Christianity, gets married, moves to England, all of that. She's not going to be publishing a book. So I think that there are more limits to her, the meaning of her exceptionality along, and whether that's about her native origins or about her gender. The limits, there are limits around her exceptionality in terms of who gets to tell the story, who gets to be in control of the adventure that he's having, the violence of that adventure, and then the kind of monumentalizing of it with the medium. So that when she's grouped with the Duchess as a patron, this is the kind of like the misogyny of that dedication. You're giving birth to this narrative. I mean, he needs an aristocratic patron because the book is expensive and he needs legitimacy, and there's all kinds of like shuffling of Elizabethan allies that go into this, or now Jacobean allies. But he's ultimately in control of the writing. So I think that and that's sort of also what I'm trying to think about is how print authorship is interacting with the early modern racial hierarchies and ideologies, but in an even more restricted way than just general concepts of humanity, right? Because a lot of the narratives in Hakluyt, they're very relativistic, granting humanity to kings in Africa and so on. But in terms of who's going to be authoring the printed object, it's even more restricted along the lines of class or gender or literacy. So I'm now attempting to neutralize Pocahontas' exceptionality as an answer to your question because she's not going to be an author.
Yeah, and there's other. I mean, it seems like in some way it could be like her gender allows for this kind of terminology about race, but not about authorship. But you're saying there's lots of people, not just women, who can occupy that position, things like that or whatever, right? So it works that way in this case, maybe not in all.
Yeah, I see. Yes, right. Yeah. But in terms of what print is going to be doing for people like Hakluyt and Smith, there's I see what you're saying though about the very kind of stark contrast I drew in describing what print does is belied by some of these examples where the exceptionality creeps in. But even I would say in the end to close off authorship or print authorship as an option for those people, even though they're granted a certain amount of humanity and equality in terms of power or just sort of sympathy for them as humans. Yeah.
I wanted to ask you a bit more about the format question, which is central to you. And I like your referring to them as Q&A. That's nice. This does foreground that question, which has been so central to Shakespeare. But what do you think? You used the term monumentalization a lot. So is it just the size of the folio, which of course folios did vary in size; they're not all gigantic. Or it strikes me that is it that already by say Hakluyt turn of the century moment, the folio is associated with compilation and a kind of compendium, because that the Hakluyt preface language is like very familiar.
Yeah.
And is picked up in the Shakespeare portfolio, like verbatim at times, right? So is it that there's something about the ideology of compilation, of bringing many things together in one book, which is associated with the folio, and is that ideology, which we see in the discourse about limbs, right? And that kind of, that Christ, imagery about resuscitation and joining limbs back together. And then is there something about that ideology of compilation that, has something to do with colonialism with that kind of the dominance of organizing, compiling, grouping, extracting.
So that's awesome, and I like the idea of folio format being a compilation. But the closest analogy for General History of Virginia is the debris, the Harriet debris, which is like almost exactly the same size and same. I mean, he's clearly just like trying to do it for Virginia. Even though there's like much more text in the Virginia book, the Harriet debris is like there's like not a lot of text, it's all image. And in that case, that's not a compilation. I mean, that's like it's like the Harriet narrative and then lots of pictures. But the idea of like the kind of gathering together and making the authoritative sort of anthology or collection, tying that to the colonial work of the books is fascinating to me, because I think that's also not something really that Mignolo talks about. I mean, a lot of works have been done since the 90s, obviously, in this question, but with Mignolo, it's about the kind of like, literacy, history, and all that. It's not as much about the kind of the format question or this idea of gathering everything together and just putting it in one box, which is what Hakluyt is doing for like the entire non-European globe. But then what Smith tries to do about Virginia. I mean, it's actually history of Virginia, New England, and the Summer Isles, so it's all the American adventures he's had or been involved with. But I'm just gonna say that's a great suggestion. I'll think more.
And remember that the Harriet you're talking about, Reed's Harriet, not Harriet
Right.
person, is part of a compilation. It's the beginning
It's the
of
beginning of
a
multiple,
massive project of compilation. I agree. That's what he's doing.
right? Many folios
The
over
Great
and over.
Voyages, the
Right.
Protestant collection, yes, in many books, but still very much.
There's a sense that Smith that the sort of trying to just fit his folio into that series.
And also don't forget purchase. I was just looking up.
Oh, yeah.
The printing of purchase. It's right around the same time, 1619, I think, 18.
Yeah.
The bigger, more Hakluyt than Hakluyt is posthumous.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think I have to do more work in thinking about that question. But those are all great analogies. I think I'm a little bit micro focused on what Smith is doing with his process here. But yeah, it's entering it.
So first of all, apologies, it's totally Victorian.
Okay,
I
great.
understand that this is not what you're interested in, but I was very struck by the potential of what you're saying to contribute to these endless ongoing debates about origins of racism, and particularly, in terms of you highlighting these texts and these books and this, these particular like compendium version of these books. It makes me think about Lauren Working's recent work on the sort of Jacobean court culture in Restoration London, and the preoccupation amongst elites there with the colonies, with an idea of the colonies, and Virginia in particular. And then I'm thinking of a bigger kind of framework of racism evolving, or racial ideas evolving on both sides of the Atlantic, being based in either Virginia and early slavery there, or in the metropole. And so I'm just wondering if you have thought about, or if you could say a bit, if you're interested in where this reading of Smith and Hakluyt fits into those debates.
So I'm not actually familiar with the book you mentioned, but yes, the huge debates about the origins of race, very charged debates about that. And I think my way of understanding the place of this work is that, the history of racial ideology, is very uneven and slow and messy, and it happens differently with different regions and different kinds of racial ideas, and different racial ideologies and categories emerge earlier than others, right? So I think, you can't really read, any of the work on anti-Blackness in the medieval period without thinking, oh yes, this is a category that emerges early and first, and the denigration of African people as an essentialized way in relation to anti-Semitism in the medieval period. But how that gets then coupled with all other different kinds of racial groups like Native Americans after Columbus, that changes the meaning of what anti-blackness means, right? So there's kind of layered way that different racial groups get defined, denigrated, and then coupled with others, right? And as ideologies of gender change, especially in the 17th century, those categories change as well. So and they're all kind of reflecting each other. And that's the way of saying it's very complicated. I think that's what historians would say. You're a historian, so I can say that. But I think for me, and this is how I kind of I think carved out interest in print authorship. I think that category, the racialization of the author as a specific kind of category, has a slightly different chronology, especially as print becomes more common in Europe in the 16th century, right? And so these men, these authors in the Renaissance who are trying to compile depictions of all different kinds of people from outside Europe into sort of a coherent object that they would then present themselves as the compiler, editor, custodian, a disseminator of. I think that there's certain kinds of foreclosures that activity itself of authorship makes that are not happening in other arenas, right? And so print authorship is a specific kind of has a specific history of racialization that might be separate from the others. That helps a little bit, but I think that when did race emerge? I mean, I think it's obviously not only with the discovery of the New World, which is what we thought maybe 15, 20 years ago, right? It's emerging earlier than that, but that doesn't mean that modern racial categories aren't themselves specific to the post-Columbus or the post-Atlantic exploration moment, which I think they are, because I think when you add the Americans to the equation, the way that all the racial groups are characterized changes. Even though the idea of an essentialized difference based on geographical origin, skin color gets kind of imported to different contexts. Yes.
A very naive observation. When I think about racial difference, I would say that I characterize one body, I characterize in a different body. And some of the questions that had us on scale was about the difference between one body and the other. My naive question looking at this, it seems like individual bodies that are depicted here are already compilations in themselves. Anatomically, nothing is correct here. The legs belong to with the body, with the head, with whatever. It's as if you have an arsenal of bodily parts that you can put together. So yes, one might end up to be taller, but maybe maybe you put the wrong arms on. And even if you look at the picture of the Duchess, that's maybe traditional on her side. But look, the arm with the foot is much longer than the other arm. It has to be stretched to get on the foot. And you look at it, it's really strange. And that kind of strangeness is a strangeness of putting bodily parts together that actually anatomically make no sense. So I wonder whether, let's call it the badness of the artist, or whatever, is already defining the purpose of stabilizing racial characteristics, or bodily intelligence. I mean, it's with her, it's with the big figure with the, I mean, nothing fits there.
Yeah, there's great work on some of these engravings. Rachel Winchcombe has a great essay on Richard Vaughn's The Engraver for the General History of Borrowings from Debris, and I'm not equipped to talk much. The scale in Debris is more anatomically correct, right? So these are I mean but the borrowings do a certain kind of work. Whether the work is like, oh, this is not very good engraving, that might be what's happening. But And the debris, of course, are from watercolors, John White's watercolors, which he did on the ground. But I'm not prepared to talk about how the scale of the bodies might relate to ideas of the human, except that there probably was a pretty low bar for people in terms of experiencing these texts as in their realism, or their representational qualities. But I don't think it would undermine certain kinds of hierarchies that are at play in the text, or in the visual iconography. I mean, it's true that Powhatan is bigger in this picture, and I don't know if the people on Zoom can see the images that I'm showing or not. We're going through the slides as we talk about things. If I reshare, but I don't yeah, I clicked it right now. This arrow. Yeah. Sorry. This guy. Okay. Yeah. So whether the differences in the lack of accurate representation in terms of the scale of the human body calls into question the kind of racial hierarchies I'm talking about. I mean, I think it's interesting. It's an interesting question. I think some of the iconography around what's signaling to people as being savage or civilized, the clothing might be more important than the scale of the limbs. But I see what you're saying. I mean, the idea of the human being a coherent thing that.
I think I'm pushing towards the compilation idea of the body,
I see,
and not just the book. That's what I'm pushing, because it can be bad, but it depends why you are bad and whether this is bad. I mean, maybe each part is fine, but once you put it together, something happens.
I mean, part of the thing about the Hakluyt is that, like, he's like, oh yeah, I put all these limbs together. I'm like, really? It just sounds like a bunch of scattered limbs to me. Like, you're Dr. Frankenstein here. Like, do these all fit together? And in my, and I had more to say about cannibalism in the chapter, but it's sort of like, I don't see a coherent body here. Like, you have failed. Like, it's all disaster. That's what you're saying.
And my question is whether you can have modern racism with non-coherent bodies.
Looks like there was at least one question on Zoom, so John, I'm gonna ask you to stop sharing again.
Yep, okay.
To be able to see.
We'll see all the Zoomers.
There we go.
Hi, everybody.
So Dan, do you wanna unmute and answer your question?
Yeah, thank you very much, and thank you, Joseph, for your talk. Actually, I want to pick up on the scattered limbs reference, and it's actually a humanist trope that Hakluyt is using, and it's derived from Plutarch's account of Isis and Osiris and the Moralia. The idea is that the torn and scattered limbs are a reference to the 14 body parts of Osiris's body that were scattered across Egypt, and they were rejoined by Isis, who kind of brought them back to life. So I don't know how much difference that makes to your argument, but it's worth reflecting on, I think, a little bit, that it may be not a Christian set of images, as you were suggesting, but one which has a different location in effect, and one which places Hakluyt in a very particular kind of company. So that may be just a footnote, but I wanted to suggest it as something to reflect on.
That's great. Thank you. I did not know that. So thank you very much. Yes, the idea that it's not, I was focused so much on the ideas of resurrection or returning the body after death, but yeah, that's definitely more complicated than that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I really enjoyed this talk, and I think it's kind of very compelling, this argument that authorship is linked to masculine and racialized support. I have a couple of comments that hopefully lead to the good question. Because I'm working on a project, so I'm a self-illusionist. So I'm not an analyst, so I apologize for the questions I'm about to ask about my comments, because I don't know. I don't know the details, but I know that so I look at a project of a woman born in and around the world who ends up going to England. She becomes a cohabitant with an Englishman, goes back to England, marries him, has his children, and converts to Christianity. And at least I've looked at some of her penmanship notebooks, and she's actually copying from racialized texts that actually in different parts of the text than what she's copying
sorts of physical habits about you. So that at least in the late, this is much later, but in the late 18th century England, it didn't seem baffling that like even things like skin color were permanent, but could be reflected by civilizational forces like conversion to Christianity specifically. So I was wondering if in fact you saw coming into play with Pocahontas. And then I had a little anecdote to share that I thought illustrates this masculine racialized authority really well in a really different context. Is this woman, so she, it kind of, her story is a colliding with the Orientalist drive to translate texts that are originated in India at that time. And there's a traveler coming, Mirza Abu comes from India to England. And he writes the story of all his travels. He wants to meet the ladies that have gone from India to join their lessons. And he writes in his account in Persian a really, really critical account of the white man that this woman had married. That he was absolutely crazy, like very pejorative. And it's translated by a very prominent Orientalist, a white man. And the account completely changes. It's billed as a translation, but the account is actually him. It changes to a violent narrative. So it really, it's fascinating the resonances across space and time. Instead of her just deciding to go with this crazy guy, but she wants to stay close to her kids, which is what the Persian account says. The new English written account is he saved her from the funeral pyre of her first husband and saved her from a violent death, and this and kind of rescued her and brought her into the Christian fold. So I know that's not a question, just a little anecdote that I found really present. But my question has to do with whether you see this Christianization making changes in physical bodies in any of the way. Sorry, one more question. Was Pocahontas alive when the 16 fellow account was published? And
Yeah,
she
but she's dead by the time of the Smith.
so she died in between the two editions. And if she does, then
I looked it up. I thought about 1617 she died.
Right, yeah.
And I wonder if her death possibly created more openings for factors.
Yeah.
Sorry for that. Really
No, that's great. And I think that just the issue of how revision changes, translation, moving from different contexts and formats, how those kinds of processes create or affect the way people are racialized in text. I think that's a giant question for almost all periods, right? So how does and it's a really great way for me, and I've worked on textual revision a lot in different contexts, to see how someone reforms a text for a different context and how the ideologies of that would change. So I love that this work you're doing. It sounds really, really great. In terms of whether religion can change your race, now I think that we see examples of Katie Childs has a great book about the late 18th century America called Transformable Race, which is all about early American racial ideology, concepts of racial difference, and how people thought if you moved to a different region or if you changed your religion, your race could change. Race was changeable for a lot of people in that period. It's hard to tell. I mean, and this is why some of the work on race is so complicated. You can find one passage in Hakluyt, it's a million words, where the race of somebody, race changes, or someone seems an African king seems totally equal, and then you say, oh, in this period, there wasn't any racism. Well, it's okay. We'll find the next passage on the next page is like totally damnable racist crap. So I think that it just some people thought religion could redeem you or change your race, and some people didn't. You look at the pictures of Pocahontas. I mean, she becomes Christian. She's got her Elizabethan, her Jacobean garb, whatever. But like, is she not an Indian? No. Like, she's superly importantly the daughter of Powhatan, who is a conquered native person from Senecomico. Like, she is Native American. So that doesn't mean in that period, it also probably meant for people that she was civilized, right? But does her her origin change, or the meaning of her skin color change? I mean, no. I mean, she was paraded around. She went to the theater. I mean, she's an icon and a kind of a a tool for people to parade English superiority, and it's all her origin, her nation is super important for the role she played in it. The question is, she died. Yeah, she died, and so Smith did whatever he wanted, and there's so many books about this issue, and Leo LeMay wrote a whole book in the 90s about, did Pocahontas save Captain Smith from execution? It's just like, oh my God, all the people who said anything about it and everything, and he says, well, I don't know if he did. So it's sort of like, he said whatever he wanted, Smith did, and because he felt rejected by the company, and one only thing he had was print, so he made up a whole bunch of stuff. But what he did and what he said worked, because that is what she symbolizes for all Anglophone culture.
And just to hear one, I think I get that feeling from the context I'm looking at. Well, there's converting women. The larger point seems to be about emphasizing the strength and gravity of English civilization, that it has the power to transform even people down so low.
Thank you so much for your talk. I was reminded when you were talking about the creation of the book as a body and is kind of different resurrections, whether it's Christian or coming from a kind of mythological background, that there's also within the 17th century of paper and paper making as a reformation of the body and a purification of the body that also then has racial implications, because writing paper is white paper. And so I know that Randy Adams and Miles Weir have kind of written about both paper and ink and their kind of racial implications. And I'm just curious if the kind of material parts of the codex, if that plays into the argument or the larger thing that you're trying to develop here.
Yes, and there's Jonathan Sension as an essay in the Stein and Cohen volume about this issue of black ink and white paper and how that overlaps with racial division. I actually haven't, I know that Malsberg is working on that question, but I haven't read his stuff yet. But I don't know, for me, if the black-white binary available on the printed page, for me, how much that affects the way I'm thinking about the format of the codex in this period, or the kind of like the book as a material, the heft of the book as a material object, and what that means for the kind of authority an author might have in having control over that format. But certainly it's important in terms of illustration, in terms of what, the kind of crude. I mean, you look at images of, even later images of Robinson Crusoe, in the black splotches, the native people, not textured, just black splotches, and my student Emily Gowan, who's in the room, has written about this. So I'm going to embarrass her by saying that, but I think it's really it's important in terms of what kind of visuals are available for readers in terms of what ink can do. Yeah.
And also, I know that in research some degree, there's examples of both professional and reader
coloring in, yeah. No, it is an interesting question. It's not something that I think has a giant effect on the way I'm thinking about what ideologies are necessary for an author to claim authority over the objects. But it is important for illustration. Yeah.
Comment. Unmute yourself, comment.
Oh, hi. Hey there. Nice to see everyone. So this was a fascinating talk, and it was really helpful to me. I was just finished talking about utopia with my students, and I think kind of thinking back on what maybe the earliest description of printing in a non-European place, where more, I mean, it's kind of where more is describing how the utopians learn from the Europeans the art of printing and papermaking, and are become very, from the very rudimentary descriptions that the Europeans give, quickly figure it out for themselves, which is this kind of interesting thing that kind of happens, and how they would have lots of texts to print, except that this description is preceded by more saying that all of his Greek books that he was bringing along with him, Raphael, were destroyed by a monkey, ripped apart by a monkey. And so sort of the lack of these texts, is lamentable for the utopians who otherwise would have the ability to kind of adopt this technology of sort of assembling these texts, which have been torn apart by this monkey. But my question is really actually about, I was curious for you to talk a bit more about the threat that the text is sort of being preserved from. I mean, I love this reading of the kind of allegory that Pocahontas is somehow kind of being paralleled with Smith's aristocratic patron as the sort of protector of the text, and sort of what that implies about the threat which is facing the text, or that kind of in the sort of parallel, or the kind of the analogy would be between the native people trying to murder or to kill John Smith, and what the forces of factional sort of enmity, or just purely just kind of the oblivion that faces any text. Or I mean, so yeah, I mean, I guess that's kind of the question that I'm just interested to hear you sort of talk through that a little bit more, because I get the sort of parallel between the patron and Pocahontas, but sort of what about the other side of that kind of equation?
I think for Smith, I mean, I had sort of have a Smith-focused view of what's happening with him in terms of his own biography and his relationship to colonization and the Virginia Company, and the king had just dissolved the Virginia Company in the wake of the attacks of 1622. So he's trying to like kind of compensate for the threat. He's trying to burnish his own personal reputation, and even the Cordo is like very much like vindication of John Smith. I mean, people hated Smith. You know, he was tried for mutiny even on the way to Jamestown. So I think he's really wanting to vindicate his own image, and he keeps writing, and he writes autobiography after autobiography. So something about him that he needs to do this. But he has patrons who are interested in Virginia, and are interested in representations of the New World and forwarding colonization efforts. I mean, it's not, Jamestown 1607 is in our minds is when that settlement started, but it wasn't in any way understood as permanent until the 1620s. So this like multi-year, almost 50-year failure of England to establish permanent settlements in the Americas, I think these printed objects are working on that and saying, we're going to have discursive control over the colonization efforts, and there's all these shipwrecks and everything, but we're going to have at least discursive control over it, which can then forward the cause. I mean, that's what Hakluyt started, and Peter Moncall does say, "Oh, John Smith had Hakluyt in Virginia." I haven't emailed him to say, "How do you know that he had it in there?" I mean, he does talk about Smith in some of the Virginia texts. He talks about Hakluyt's texts, but it's not. I haven't found the object yet. But these are instruments of colonization, so you need the book to have the voyage. I mean, Smith has the maps in Smith are very famous. The maps, because they were sort of semi-accurate depictions of the regions. So what is the threat that Pocahontas is saving him from? Well, it's the threat that England's colonies will be dissolved, and also the threat that John Smith will be forgotten. I think that's probably the more important aspect, because there are lots of people working on the settlements, especially at this time. Smith was sidelined, so he turned to print. So for him, it's probably about his own legacy, and understanding that that folio was a way to preserve that legacy more than the kind of ephemeral formats that he had engaged in earlier. So I do think it's about him in a way, but I'd have to think more about what is the broader print culture of colonization at this time, and that is a question I'm not prepared to answer at this particular moment, although I think Smith illustrates some things about that broader effort. Chat. Where's the chat?
Island monitors.
Yeah.
Those will be island.
Island,
Summarize the questions for.
Oh, I see. Okay.
They can't hear it.
Okay.
Well, I'll throw in a couple of things if there's a well. Great stuff, Joe. Thank you so much. three big things. Pick what you want or pick none. I really don't know much about John Smith's publishers, and I never thought about it, so you make me think about it. Great, goes through lots of editions, an expensive book, as you point out. Our copy is from 1632, that's already suggesting the longevity is not bad. The other editions, I think, in the 1620s. I think maybe not all the same printer, but I don't know these guys, and I wonder if you do. I mean, that's an investment on your point about investment. It's interesting to think about. Second thing, certainly I always found it interesting. I mean, you know, the book at moment of failure. I mean, you could argue with Hakluyt too. I mean, these are moments of colonial disaster consistently. Arrogant. I mean, come on, it's one loss, is that failure, mistake, you know, and the pretense of the principal navigation, the absurdity of the principal navigation as a book is, you know, there's no, you know, it's Antonio Spain who is the power worth worrying about from that point of view. So it's a sweet project, but it's interesting. I mean, putting Smith in that context at a moment of colonial disaster, personal but also collective, it's just interesting to see where the Codex goes into that. And the third thing, goes back to your abstract a little bit, is the word European. Peter Dalibras would ask this question where you're here. It's not that Europe as a term isn't often cited, of course, but the term European and Europe is trickier, I think, and it goes in and out. I mean, sometimes it's Christian, you know, there's lots of other ways of representing that. Yes, and not even the region so much as the peoples, is there even some kind of collectiveness to it? Is that an anachronistic issue? I just think it's something you might have to want to worry about a little bit in this project, which is going to go forward from here. Final question: what comes after John Smith in your book? Because I'm curious what the next chapter is. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Those are great. I'm not going to answer all those questions.
I understand.
I actually don't know enough about the printers to answer that question, which is super embarrassing as a book history person. I'm more contemplating text. Okay, but you're right, and I have more to say about failure in the chapter version of this. I sort of like, and this came up with the question of are the limbs really stuck back together or not?
Yeah.
So I think that the Hakluyt's desperation for England to do anything in the colonies is so apparent in his career, and you know, pushing these books on everybody is like part of it. Yes, you need more navigation, you need more navigation. So I think that some of the way he talks about printing in his prefatory material, with all the origins and the different traditions we've discussed, I think a lot of it has to do with like, I've worked so hard, you know, all the travail and all of my bodily aches, and for what? Like, England doesn't have a colony. So he's really, I think that's really, the failure of England to establish colonies is really important to him. By the time Smith does in 1624, you know, oh, okay, there's a settlement in Plymouth, like the Jamestown settlement has not been totally destroyed, so there's a little bit more evidence that England might have been getting going. But I think some of the like hyper insistence upon, you know, the triumph of certain historical actors in these texts, the circumnavigations in Hakluyt or Smith's own adventures in Virginia, are the like insisting upon those, the triumph of those, and inflating the number of natives that you encountered, has to do probably with the hitherto failure of England to really make any noise at all on the stage. And I think that's something that I could talk about more. I do bring out a little bit in the chapter, but it's a moment of failure for that. I think I'm just going to say you're probably right. The word European is anachronistic here. It comes from the Hakluyt describes he was in France and people were just, you know, shitting on England. Oh, England hasn't done anything on the world stage, and so he's pissed about that. So he does the principal navigation. So I'm thinking, okay, Hakluyt has in his mind a kind of like, you know, at least international or community of readers. He prints a lot of the principal navigations has accounts in Latin and in English and the vernacular. So he thinks he's seeing a kind of like a quasi-European man of letters. I'm not going to give it up. I can just say it's anachronistic and keep the term. That's what I would tell Peter too. So I think it is. I think it's the Christendom thing is important. Christian is important. Civilization is important. Protestantism is important.
You know,
But there's a rivalry with Spain, the war with Spain. But I think that there's a sense that like he wants his whatever peers he feels are in the great nations of at least Western Europe. He wants them to see that England has navigations, right? And has a history of navigation. It's a European rivalry that makes him want to.
But it's just, for your project, you also want to make it a racial category. So I think this is where
It's really
it's gonna matter, right?
it's really pre-racial, but yes, I see what you're saying.
Yeah.
Okay, all right. Good. I wanted to.
What's the next chapter?
Okay, so the next chapter, I'd be perfectly happy to talk about the next step, because the next step actually is the late 17th century Mary Rowlandson and Aphrodite. And what they do is they say, we're gonna print stuff as women, which is like really unusual in England. But guess what? We're super white, and that's why we can do it. And so the kind of like the white woman author of the Restoration period intensifies, and that's also the discourse of whiteness emerges really in the late 17th century. Say what you want about race as a category, but whiteness, the word white, is really a late 17th century thing that people like Ben and Rowlandson embrace as they establish their own authority as women writers in the medium of print. And that is kind of like the step, the late 17th, early 18th century step is really also the rise of the female author as a category that speaks uniquely to the experience of women. And that also with like Eliza Haywood and other people in the 18th century, female Quixote and stuff like that. So the next step, and all of this, of course, is leading to Phyllis Wheatley, who in 1773 publishes the Poems on Various Subjects of Religious and Moral, and is received principally as an African, but also as a woman writer. And the category of the female author speaking uniquely to gendered experience does then pave the way for Wheatley's unique and kind of shocking reception in the 1770s. So it is a little teleological, which I think is fine to get to Wheatley, but we are starting here in this period where you have the white men dealing with their codices in the New World. Then you get to the white women authors, and then you get to Wheatley in the middle. She's like the middle of the book.
Maybe our last temple.
I did a great job. Meticulous as always. And I'm sorry to return to subjects, which I'm sure you're entirely tired, both Pocahontas and that image, but I have to nonetheless. And it's a good segue from John's set of concerns in the next chapter. But I was wondering about, and I don't work on this period, so maybe this is a full pet, but how the representation of Pocahontas accorded with the gender ideology of the time. Because as you know, during this period, size mattered, right? I'm thinking of the famous argument from maybe sex that this is the period when we see gender become not a quantity but quality. And by the way, that does put me in mind of the size of the people. Yeah. I wonder if that matches. But how does this? Because she just struck me as kind of more in keeping with the 19th century sort of Republican motherhood, sort of this domestic warrior, and sympathy, all of that. More than, as I understand this period, to understand womanhood. So, is there some kind of conflict, or is this in keeping with? Well, obviously she's not white, so that's already something. But
yeah, so I think I would say I just shared my screen so the Zoomers can see it. I think I would say that Pocahontas's stature as the king's daughter is so important to how she's seen as the major figure in the text, and that would tie that to the aristocratic stature of the Duchess. So there are lots of native women in the text, but they're all only the aristocratic ones are mentioned by name or seen as important at all. So I think that it's not really a Republican motherhood thing. I mean, it's like a royalty. It's a royalty thing here that's happening with her that gives her the privileged position, and then also that Smith kind of sucks away her aristocratic authority and gives it to himself through a moment like this, where she saves his life. Does that answer?
I was thinking more about the sympathy part of the way that she's represented, this sort of big heart person available to I mean, that is the cult of domestic divinity. As you well know.
It's also chivalric. So her selflessness and as kind of like his saving his life and that seems to me also kind of like an earlier model of a gendered behavior than that. But we do have sympathy for her in the text because we have sympathy for her because she is so obsessed with saving Smith and the colonists in the narrative.
Explain why she was so popular on the 19th
It's
century.
medieval. It's very medieval.
Yeah.
The whole 19th century theater about Pocahontas.
Yeah, absolutely.
But there is that
Just being
prehistory of,
realistic.
in chivalric romance of the Christian, the white Christian man who marries the other woman who saves his life in that way.
It's chivalric. It's kind of like the genealogy goes all the way back yet to medieval.
Given how the 24 version is quite successful, but it's like, I think John Smith was right to include that material, from his publisher's perspective, right? It's much more successful than the preceding. And he is adding this romantic, in the older sense, the genre of romance, as much as epic, is there, which is turning it into a very different kind of story.
I don't know who told him he's a terrible writer and he's not very smart. So I don't know who told him. I don't know who told him to say, "Hey, this Pocahontas stuff, she's dead. Like, do whatever you want with that story." But
Michael Spark.
But it could have been his publisher or whatever. I don't know. It's just he made it a smart friend.
All right, last comment.
But-
Last
okay,
comment.
Thanks again. This has been a great conversation. I just have a short question.
Okay.
Were there other forms of authorship alongside the Codex in this period? Because I've definitely seen that authorship in the Codex are nearing here, but were there other forms of significant authorship available? And I would like to talk a little bit about.
The Renaissance. So yeah, lots and lots of different kinds of ways of, the theater, occasional poetry, anonymous poetry, all kinds of popular culture, carnivalesque things. I think, there's a giant heterogeneity of the printed text. It's not as heterogeneous as the 19th century, which is where my project ends, where you have just print all over the place. But there's a real heterogeneity of authorship happening. That of which I think that these, again, the folios are the thing that I'm mostly focused on.
So it's part of your argument that this is not only about developing authorship in the Codex, it's also consolidating kind of strength and advocacy of the Codex as a source of authority as well.
Yeah, so the special magic of this kind of format to make people confident that when they read it, something authoritative is happening, that they're understanding a culture or all of England's navigations, or the general history of Virginia, or later the kind of like for Phyllis Wheatley. Phyllis Wheatley's book is small. It's an octavo. It's not a folio, but it's small. But she has a frontispiece there. Oh, this is an important object, more important than other objects in print, and so it's going to tell me something unique about a group of people. Yeah.
I think.
Okay, I think we better wrap.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you, everybody. This is very helpful.